October 10/20th, 1942. 600 miles northeast of the Santa Cruz Islands, Lieutenant Ayao Shirane sat in the cramped cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, his hand resting on the throttle as he scanned the Pacific horizon. The dawn light painted the ocean in shades of crimson and gold, and somewhere below that vast emptiness, the American carrier task force maneuvered invisible, protected by distance and darkness, but not, Shirane believed, beyond reach. His radio crackled with routine chatter from other pilots in his formation. Fuel status checks, weather observations, the casual confidence of men who had owned these skies for 10 months, who had swept Allied forces from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies with a speed that shocked the world. Shirane had personally claimed 4 American aircraft in combat. His squadron had sunk a destroyer and damaged 2 cruisers. The Americans were brave, certainly, but they were fighting with equipment that seemed perpetually one step behind Japanese capabilities. Then, at precisely 06:15, something changed. Shirane's radio erupted with urgent transmissions. American fighters, dozens of them, climbing rapidly from below the cloud deck, positioning themselves with impossible precision exactly where Japanese strike aircraft were approaching. The American Wildcats shouldn't have known they were coming. The strike had launched from carriers 200 miles away, maintained radio silence, approached at wave-top altitude to avoid detection. Yet somehow, the Americans were waiting, positioned perfectly, attacking with coordination that suggested they had known the Japanese were coming long before visual contact. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Within 20 minutes, Shirane watched 6 aircraft from his formation spiral into the ocean, trailing smoke and flame. The Americans withdrew with minimal losses, having intercepted the strike package with accuracy that defied explanation. When surviving pilots gathered aboard Zuikaku that evening, the confused reports began flowing. They knew exactly where we were, Lieutenant Commander Mamoru Seki told the intelligence officer during debriefing. Not approximately, not generally. They knew our altitude, our heading, our exact position. It was as if they could see through clouds and darkness. The intelligence officer, a career naval officer named Nakamura, who had studied radio technology before the war, asked a question that would haunt Japanese naval aviation for the remainder of the conflict. Did you detect any unusual radio transmissions during your approach? The pilots looked at one another with dawning recognition. Yes, several had heard strange pulsing signals on their radio receivers. Brief, rhythmic, seemingly meaningless. Most had dismissed it as atmospheric interference or American communications equipment malfunctioning. None had understood they were hearing their own death sentences being transmitted. What Lieutenant Shirane and thousands of Japanese naval aviators would gradually, painfully come to understand over the next 3 years was that they were fighting an enemy whose technological capabilities exceeded anything Japanese intelligence had predicted. The strange radio signals were radar pulses, emitted by systems so sophisticated they could detect aircraft formations at ranges approaching 20 miles, could track them through clouds and darkness, could vector defending fighters with precision that made visual scouting obsolete. The Americans weren't simply brave or determined. They possessed technology that fundamentally altered the mathematics of aerial combat. Japanese pilots, regardless of their skill or courage, were operating at a permanent disadvantage that no amount of training could overcome. They were visible to an enemy they couldn't see, tracked by systems they didn't fully understand, intercepted by forces that seemed to possess supernatural awareness of Japanese movements. The story of how Japanese pilots came to understand American radar superiority is not one of single dramatic moments or climactic revelations. It is a story of accumulated evidence, of countless encounters where confusion gave way to recognition, where confidence eroded into bitter acknowledgement of technological inferiority. It is the story of men who entered combat, believing in their equipment and their training, and who gradually learned they were fighting a war where the fundamental rules had changed without anyone informing them. The Japanese Naval Air Force that attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, represented the finest carrier aviation force in the world. Japan possessed 6 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers, more than any other nation. The pilots were veterans with an average of 800 flight hours, many with combat experience from China. Their aircraft, particularly the A6M0 fighter, were technologically superior to anything the Allies could field in the Pacific. The Zero could outmaneuver, outclimb, and outrange American fighters. Its 20mm cannon armament was devastating. Its operational radius of 1,100 miles allowed strikes far beyond the range of American carrier aircraft. Japanese torpedo bombers and dive bombers had demonstrated lethal effectiveness at Pearl Harbor, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and establishing Japanese naval aviation as the dominant force in the Pacific. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, wrote in his combat report that American defenses seemed almost pathetically unprepared. "We achieved complete surprise," he noted. American aircraft were lined up on runways, easy targets. American ships were anchored in neat rows, virtually defenseless. Our pilots attacked with precision and faced minimal opposition. The Americans appeared to possess no warning system capable of detecting our approach. This assessment, accurate on December 7, 1941, would become tragically obsolete within months as American radar technology matured and proliferated across the Pacific. But Japanese intelligence, fixated on visible assets like ships and aircraft, fundamentally underestimated the invisible revolution occurring in American electronics laboratories. The Japanese understanding of radar in 1941 was primitive compared to American and British capabilities. Japan had developed basic radar systems beginning in the late 1930s, primarily for naval gunnery control. The Type 21 air search radar, mounted on battleships and cruisers, could detect aircraft at ranges of approximately 50 miles under ideal conditions. Japanese scientists understood the theoretical principles of radio detection and ranging, but Japanese industry lacked the manufacturing capacity and specialized components necessary to produce radar sets in quantity or with capabilities matching Western systems. More critically, Japanese military doctrine didn't prioritize radar development. The emphasis remained on offensive action, long-range strikes, and pilot skill. Defensive technologies like radar were considered less important than offensive weapons like torpedoes, bombs, and cannon. This doctrinal blind spot would prove catastrophic as the war progressed and American radar transformed from experimental equipment into the backbone of integrated air defense systems. Japanese pilots received minimal training regarding radar threats. Most aviators entering combat in 1942 had never seen a radar display, didn't understand how radar worked, and couldn't recognize the electromagnetic signatures that would increasingly surround them as American radar deployment expanded. When Lieutenant Shirane heard those strange pulsing signals during his approach to the American task force in October 1942, he lacked the knowledge to understand he was being tracked, measured, and targeted by invisible beams emanating from ships beyond the horizon. The American radar advantage began modestly but expanded with terrifying speed. The CXAM radar, installed on American carriers beginning in 1940, could detect aircraft at ranges of 50 to 70 miles. By mid-1942, improved SC and SK radar sets extended detection ranges to over 100 miles with increased reliability and accuracy. SC-2 radar, introduced in late 1942, featured plan position indicator displays that showed aircraft positions as blips on a circular screen, allowing operators to track multiple targets simultaneously, and vector fighters with unprecedented precision. The impact on carrier operations was revolutionary. American task force commanders could detect incoming strikes while they were still an hour away, providing ample time to launch fighters, position combat air patrols at optimal altitudes and headings, and prepare ships for defensive maneuvering. Japanese pilots approaching American task forces were being watched, tracked, and countered long before they achieved visual contact. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 demonstrated American radar's potential, though Japanese commanders initially failed to recognize its significance. American radar detected the Japanese strike wave inbound to Midway Island, while aircraft were still 75 miles distant. American fighters launched immediately and intercepted Japanese bombers far from their targets, inflicting casualties and disrupting formations before the bombs were released. Japanese pilots reported unexpectedly strong fighter opposition that seemed to appear from nowhere. Intelligence officers attributed this to American visual scouting or perhaps chance encounter. The possibility that American radar had detected the strike wave while it was still beyond visual range, had calculated its heading and speed, and had vectored fighters to intercept with mathematical precision. This possibility wasn't seriously considered because Japanese planners couldn't conceive of radar operating with such effectiveness. The pattern repeated throughout 1942 and into 1943. American fighters appeared with suspicious regularity exactly where Japanese strike aircraft were approaching. American combat air patrols seemed to know Japanese altitudes and headings before visual contact. American ships maneuvered evasively minutes before Japanese bombers arrived, suggesting advance warning from sources Japanese intelligence couldn't identify. Slowly, reluctantly, Japanese naval aviators began suspecting the truth. The Americans possessed detection equipment far superior to anything Japanese forces could deploy. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, a Pearl Harbor veteran and experienced fighter leader, wrote in his diary in March 1943, "American fighters intercept our strikes with accuracy that cannot be explained by visual scouting or chance. They position themselves at our exact altitude, on reciprocal headings, as if guided by invisible hands." Several pilots report hearing pulsing radio signals during approaches to American task forces. "I believe the Americans have perfected radio detection equipment that can find us at great distances." Itaya's suspicions were correct but understated the magnitude of American radar capabilities. By mid-1943, American carriers routinely operated radar sets that could detect aircraft formations at ranges exceeding 100 miles, could distinguish between friendly and enemy aircraft based on IFF transponder responses, and could guide multiple fighter divisions simultaneously to intercept separate threats. The radar operators themselves, trained extensively in specialized schools established across the United States, could interpret display returns with expertise that transformed raw data into actionable tactical intelligence. The infrastructure supporting American radar was equally impressive and completely invisible to Japanese intelligence. Radar maintenance required specialized technicians, spare parts, test equipment, and technical manuals, an entire logistics system dedicated solely to keeping radar sets operational. American carriers carried radar technicians as permanent crew members, men trained at facilities like the Navy Radio Materiel School in Washington, D.C., who could diagnose and repair complex electronic equipment under combat conditions. Japanese ships, by contrast, often operated with radar sets that malfunctioned regularly and remained non-operational for weeks due to lack of spare parts or trained personnel. The few Japanese radar sets that were deployed suffered reliability problems that American technicians had solved through systematic testing and component improvement. Japanese industry, stretched thin across multiple war fronts and constrained by limited access to rare materials like germanium for crystal detectors, couldn't match American production of reliable radar components. The technological gap manifested in ways that shocked Japanese pilots when they learned the details. American radar sets used cavity magnetrons, British-invented devices that generated centimetric wavelength radar pulses with power levels exceeding anything Japanese transmitters could produce. These short wavelength radars were largely immune to atmospheric interference, provided superior target resolution, and were compact enough to install in fighters and torpedo bombers, extending radar coverage to tactical levels Japanese forces never achieved. American airborne radar development proceeded with particular urgency. The ASE radar, installed in Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers beginning in 1943, allowed individual aircraft to detect surface ships at ranges exceeding 20 miles and navigate precisely to targets in darkness or through clouds. Japanese torpedo bombers possessed no equivalent capability, limiting them to daylight attacks in good weather when visual navigation was possible. American night fighters, equipped with AI Mark IV radar, could detect enemy aircraft at ranges of 3 to 5 miles and track them for interception even in complete darkness. Japanese night fighter development lagged years behind, with early attempts using searchlights and visual acquisition proving ineffective against American bomber formations that attacked under cover of darkness. The cumulative effect of American radar superiority created an invisible defensive dome around American task forces that Japanese pilots couldn't penetrate without suffering catastrophic losses. Every approach was detected. Every strike was intercepted. Every attack faced prepared defenses because American radar provided the one resource that determined all combat outcomes: time. Time to launch fighters, time to position defenses, time to prepare ships for evasive action. Time transformed chaos into coordinated response, and American radar provided that time consistently, reliably, at ranges Japanese forces couldn't match. By late 1943, experienced Japanese pilots understood they were fighting at a permanent disadvantage. The Americans knew where Japanese aircraft were before Japanese pilots knew where Americans were. This asymmetry, simple to state but devastating in practice, fundamentally altered the mathematics of aerial combat. Superior piloting skill and aircraft maneuverability couldn't compensate for being detected first, tracked continuously, and intercepted by forces that possessed complete situational awareness. Lieutenant Shirane, who had survived the Santa Cruz encounter in October 1942, flew his final mission in November 1943 near Rabaul. American fighters intercepted his formation 60 miles from their target, attacking with precision that suggested they had tracked the Japanese strike aircraft from launch. Shirane's Zero was hit by multiple .50 caliber rounds that severed control cables and ignited his fuel tank. He died attempting to ditch in the ocean, one of hundreds of experienced Japanese pilots lost to an enemy whose technological capabilities exceeded anything Japanese training had prepared them to face. His squadron mates, returning to Rabaul with heavy losses and minimal success, filed combat reports describing American interception tactics that seemed supernatural in their precision. Intelligence officers could no longer dismiss these reports as exaggeration or confusion. The evidence was overwhelming and consistent. American forces possessed detection equipment that provided decisive tactical advantages Japanese forces couldn't counter. The question facing Japanese naval aviation by early 1944 was not whether American radar was superior, that was obvious to anyone analyzing combat reports objectively, but whether Japan possessed the industrial capacity and technical expertise to develop countermeasures before American air superiority became absolute. The answer, though few dared state it publicly, was already clear to those who understood the scale of American technological mobilization. Japan was fighting a war where the fundamental rules had changed, where invisibility mattered more than speed, where detection range exceeded weapon range, where electrons and radio waves determined outcomes as decisively as bombs and bullets. Japanese pilots, trained in traditional air combat tactics and flying aircraft designed for visual engagement, were obsolete before they launched. The ocean of air above the Pacific belonged to those who could see furthest, and American radar had given the United States eyes that penetrated darkness, clouds, and distance with capabilities Japanese forces would never match. The transformation from suspicion to certainty came through accumulated encounters that left no room for alternative explanations. Japanese pilots weren't simply losing battles, they were being systematically hunted by forces that seemed to possess complete awareness of their movements while remaining invisible themselves. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 would provide Japanese naval aviators with the most devastating demonstration of American radar superiority in the entire war. What Japanese planners had conceived as a decisive carrier battle that would restore naval balance in the Pacific instead became a massacre so one-sided that American pilots dubbed it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Japanese mobile fleet with 9 carriers and 473 aircraft. His plan relied on Japanese aircraft's superior range. Zeros and bombers could strike American carriers from distances American aircraft couldn't match, allowing Japanese carriers to remain beyond American strike range while attacking with impunity. It was sound tactical theory that completely failed to account for American radar capabilities. The battle began on the morning of June 19, 1944. Ozawa launched his first wave of 69 aircraft at 0830, confident they would catch American carriers by surprise. What Ozawa didn't know was that American radar had detected Japanese scout planes at dawn and had been tracking Japanese carrier movements for hours. Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, had positioned itself perfectly to receive the Japanese strikes while preparing counterstrikes of devastating scale. At 10 to 100 hours, when the first Japanese strike wave was still 75 miles from American carriers, radar, operators aboard USS Lexington detected the incoming formation. The warning provided 30 precious minutes, that transformed the battle's outcome. American carriers launched every available fighter. Combat air patrols climbed to optimal interception altitudes. Ships maneuvered into defensive formations. Anti-aircraft crews prepared for action. When Japanese aircraft finally arrived within visual range of American ships, they faced a reception that stunned survivors. Lieutenant Junior Grade Zenji Abe, flying an A6M50 as escort for dive bombers, later described the approach to American interrogators after his capture. We expected to find American carriers launching aircraft in confusion, attempting to respond to our surprise attack. Instead, we encountered a wall of fighters at our exact altitude, positioned perfectly to intercept us before we reached our targets. American Hellcats attacked in coordinated divisions, suggesting they had been guided to us with precise information about our position, altitude, and heading. We were not surprising them. They were waiting for us as if they had received engraved invitations announcing our arrival. The slaughter was comprehensive. Of the 69 aircraft in the first wave, 42 were destroyed, a loss rate of 61%. The survivors achieved minimal damage to American ships. Japanese pilots who returned reported fighter opposition of intensity, suggesting the Americans had known exactly when and where the strike would arrive. Ozawa, unaware of the disaster unfolding, launched 3 more strikes throughout the day. Each wave was detected by American radar while still beyond visual range. Each wave was intercepted by fighters positioned with mathematical precision. Each wave suffered catastrophic losses. By day's end, Japanese naval aviation had lost approximately 343 aircraft and hundreds of irreplaceable trained pilots. American losses totaled 29 aircraft, most to operational accidents rather than combat. The statistical disparity represented more than tactical defeat. It demonstrated that Japanese aircraft, regardless of their range or maneuverability, couldn't survive against an enemy who could see them coming from 75 miles away and had 30 minutes to prepare perfect defensive responses. The invisible dome of American radar coverage had transformed carrier warfare into a shooting gallery where Japanese pilots were targets and American fighters were hunters, guided by electronic omniscience. Warrant Officer Sakai Yamamoto, a veteran pilot who survived the battle despite watching his entire squadron destroyed, wrote in his diary that night, "The Americans knew everything. They knew when we launched. They knew our heading and altitude. They positioned their fighters exactly where we would arrive, at the precise moment we would arrive. Fighting them is like fighting an enemy who can read our thoughts and see through in clouds. Our courage means nothing against such capabilities." The technological specifics of American radar that enabled this massacre were staggering when examined in detail. The SK-2 air search radar, standard equipment on American carriers by June 1944, transmitted pulses at frequencies around 200 MHz, with peak power output of 250 kilowatts. The massive Yagi antennas, rotating continuously at speeds of 6 revolutions per minute, swept the horizon in all directions, detecting aircraft returns that appeared as bright spots on circular plan position indicator displays. Radar operators, trained for months to interpret these displays, could distinguish between individual aircraft, formations of various sizes, and could estimate altitude based on signal strength and other technical factors. The operators worked in teams, with supervisors coordinating information from multiple radar sets and communicating directly with fighter direction officers, who controlled combat air patrols via radio. This integrated system radar detection, central processing, radio communication, and fighter direction represented a revolution in military coordination that Japanese forces had never implemented. Japanese carriers in June 1944 typically possessed 1 or 2 radar sets of limited capability, no plan position indicator displays, inadequate communication between radar operators and fighter controllers, and pilots who lacked training in responding to radar-directed interception instructions. The American fighter direction officers, specialists trained at facilities like the Navy Fighter Directors School in Pearl Harbor, could simultaneously guide multiple fighter divisions to separate intercepts, stacking formations at different altitudes to create layered defenses, positioning fighters upsun from approaching enemy aircraft, and ensuring that no Japanese strike could penetrate the defensive umbrella without facing overwhelming opposition. Lieutenant Joseph Eggert, a fighter direction officer aboard USS Enterprise during the Philippine Sea Battle, described his role in a post-war interview. "We could see Japanese formations on radar while they were still an hour away. I had time to calculate optimal interception points, brief fighter divisions on enemy altitude and heading, launch additional fighters if necessary, and position our defenses perfectly. The Japanese never had a chance because we controlled the information battle space completely. They were blind men stumbling toward opponents who could see perfectly." Japanese pilots gradually came to understand they were fighting not just against American aircraft, but against an entire system of detection, communication, and coordination that Japanese forces couldn't replicate. Individual pilot skill became irrelevant when the enemy knew your position. Altitude, speed, and heading continuously from ranges exceeding visual distance. The few Japanese radar sets that were deployed proved hopelessly inferior to American systems. The Type 21 and later Type 13 air search radars suffered from limited range, typically 40 to 50 miles, compared to American sets that routinely detected aircraft at 100 miles, inadequate displays that showed only range without bearing information, and chronic reliability problems that left sets non-operational for extended periods. More critically, Japanese radar sets lacked the power output and antenna design that gave American radars their decisive advantages. American cavity magnetron technology, developed through collaboration between British and American scientists at MIT's Radiation Laboratory, generated microwave frequency pulses with power levels Japanese transmitters couldn't approach. These high-frequency, high-power radars provided target resolution and detection ranges that Japanese lower-frequency sets could never match. Japanese electronics industry, constrained by limited access to critical materials and lacking the specialized manufacturing techniques American industry had perfected, couldn't produce cavity magnetrons in quantity even when the theoretical principles were understood. The gap wasn't just technological, it was industrial. American factories were producing radar sets faster than Japan could conceive countermeasures, deploying them across hundreds of ships and thousands of aircraft, creating an electromagnetic net that covered the entire Pacific. By mid-1944, American submarines were equipped with surface search radar that allowed them to detect Japanese ships at night from ranges exceeding 20 miles. American patrol bombers carried airborne search radar that could find Japanese convoys in darkness or through clouds. American fighters possessed tail-warning radar that alerted pilots when enemy aircraft approached from behind. American torpedo bombers navigated to targets using radar that penetrated weather and darkness. The electromagnetic spectrum had become an American domain where Japanese forces operated blind. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots manifested in ways that shocked senior commanders. Mission abort rates increased as pilots reported equipment malfunctions that investigation revealed were often fabricated excuses to avoid combat. Veteran pilots requested transfers to training commands, preferring the dishonor of leaving combat units to the certainty of death, fighting an enemy whose technological advantages made survival impossible. Lieutenant Commander Shigetaka Omori, an experienced dive bomber pilot with over 2,000 flight hours, wrote to his wife in August 1944, "I no longer believe we can win. The Americans possess equipment we cannot match. They see us before we see them. They intercept us before we reach our targets. They shoot us down with efficiency that suggests we are merely targets in a training exercise. My squadron has lost 23 pilots in 6 weeks. Not through cowardice or poor training, but because we are fighting an enemy who has solved problems we didn't know existed. I fly each mission knowing it will likely be my last, not because I lack courage, but because American technology makes our deaths inevitable." The radar advantage extended beyond carrier battles to land-based operations, where the disparity became even more pronounced. American forces operating from captured islands established radar networks that provided complete coverage of surrounding airspace. Japanese aircraft approaching these islands were detected while still hundreds of miles away, allowing American fighters based on the islands to intercept with such consistency that Japanese bomber formations suffered loss rates exceeding 70%. The campaign for the Marianas in summer 1944 demonstrated American radar's strategic impact. Japanese aircraft based on Guam, Saipan, and Tinian attempted to attack American invasion forces, but were systematically destroyed by fighters guided by ship-based and island-based radar. American radar operators detected Japanese aircraft taking off from their own bases, tracked them throughout their approach, and vectored fighters to intercept them before they reached American ships. Warrant Officer Kiyoshi Ogawa, a bomber pilot who survived 7 missions against American forces in the Marianas, described the experience as psychologically devastating. "We would take off from our base, form up over the island, and turn toward American ships. Within 10 minutes, American fighters would appear, attacking with coordination that proved they had tracked us from takeoff. We never achieved surprise. We never approached undetected. Every mission was a death sentence for most of the formation. I survived through luck, not skill. American radar made skill irrelevant." The technological examination of captured American radar equipment provided Japanese engineers with sobering insights into the magnitude of their inferiority. In October 1944, Japanese forces captured an SCR-584 fire control radar set intact from an American airfield in the Philippines. The radar, designed to direct anti-aircraft artillery fire, operated at microwave frequencies with pulse power and precision that astonished Japanese technicians who examined it. Engineer Captain Tsuneo Nakamura, assigned to evaluate the captured radar, filed a report that reached the Naval General Staff in November 1944. His conclusions were bleak. The captured radar represents technological capabilities at least 5 years beyond current Japanese production. The cavity magnetron generates pulse power we cannot replicate. The servo mechanisms that automatically track targets operate with precision our mechanical industry cannot manufacture. The display systems provide information clarity we have never achieved. Most critically, this is merely one example of American radar technology, and American forces possess hundreds or thousands of such sets deployed across the Pacific. We are not competing with American radar capability. We are competing with American industrial capacity to produce sophisticated electronics equipment in quantities that dwarf anything Japan can achieve. The report circulated through Japanese Naval Aviation Command, confirming what combat veterans had been reporting for months. American radar superiority was absolute. Japanese forces possessed no effective countermeasures, and the technological gap was widening rather than narrowing as American industry accelerated production while Japanese manufacturing capacity declined under sustained bombing. Japanese attempts to develop radar countermeasures proved futile. Radar warning receivers, designed to alert pilots when they were being tracked by American radar, were produced in small quantities but provided no practical benefit. Knowing you were being tracked didn't help when you lacked technology to jam the radar, evade the tracking, or engage targets beyond visual range. Chaff strips of aluminum foil designed to confuse radar displays was tested, but never deployed in significant quantities due to manufacturing limitations. And because Japanese commanders recognized that chaff would be far more effective against Japanese radar than against American systems. Creating radar confusion benefited the side with superior radar density, which was overwhelmingly American. Electronic jamming equipment was conceptualized but never produced because Japanese electronics industry lacked components, manufacturing techniques, and electrical power generation capacity to build effective jammers. The few experimental units created proved ineffective against American radars operating at frequencies and power levels Japanese engineers couldn't adequately counter. The cumulative result was that Japanese pilots faced American radar with no effective countermeasures, no tactical solutions, and no hope that technology would shift in their favor. They were fighting a losing battle where every engagement reinforced American advantages and Japanese disadvantages. By early 1945, Japanese naval aviation had been reduced to desperation tactics that acknowledged technological inferiority. The kamikaze program, which began in October 1944, represented explicit admission that Japanese pilots couldn't survive long enough to deliver conventional attacks against American forces. If pilots were going to die regardless, and American radar made death nearly inevitable, then suicide attacks at least guaranteed that deaths accomplished something. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who organized the first kamikaze units, stated the logic explicitly to his pilots. American defenses, guided by their superior radar, destroy our bombers before they can release their weapons. If our pilots deliberately crash their aircraft into ships, at least their sacrifice will not be wasted. We have no technology that can overcome American radar. We have no time to develop such technology. We must use our spirit to compensate for our technological inferiority. The statement represented complete psychological defeat. Japanese naval aviation had begun the war confident in their technological equality, if not superiority. By 1945, they were acknowledging that American technology had advanced so far beyond Japanese capabilities that the only response was suicide attacks that circumvented the need for surviving long enough to escape after delivering weapons. Ensign Teruo Yamaguchi, assigned to a kamikaze unit in April 1945, wrote in his final letter to his parents, "I am not afraid to die for Japan, but I must tell you truthfully that we are not dying as heroes defeating a worthy enemy. We are dying because American technology has made conventional combat impossible. Their radar sees us from distances we cannot comprehend. Their fighters intercept us with precision we cannot match. Their anti-aircraft fire, guided by radar, destroys our aircraft before we approach our targets. The kamikaze program exists because we have no other option. American radar has made us obsolete." The final revelation came not through combat but through surrender. When Japanese naval aviators were taken aboard American carriers in August 1945, they witnessed technology that explained every mysterious intercept, every impossible ambush, every devastating defeat they had experienced. Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most accomplished naval aviators and a principal planner of the Pearl Harbor attack, was brought aboard USS Shangri-La in late August. American officers, proud of their technological achievements, gave him a comprehensive tour of the carrier's Combat Information Center. What Genda saw shocked him more profoundly than any battle he had survived. The radar room contained multiple displays operating simultaneously. SK air search radar tracked aircraft across ranges exceeding 100 miles. SG surface search radar detected ships beyond the horizon. Fire control radars directed anti-aircraft guns with computer-assisted precision. Fighter direction officers coordinated defensive operations from a dedicated facility where all radar information merged into comprehensive tactical pictures displayed on illuminated plotting boards. "This is what we faced," Genda told his fellow prisoners that evening. Not superior piloting or better tactics, but complete situational awareness provided by technology we never possessed. They saw everything. We saw nothing. The outcome was determined before combat began. American radar operators demonstrated their capabilities with casual confidence that emphasized Japanese inferiority. They showed Genda recordings of radar tracks from actual battles where Japanese formations had been detected 75 miles distant, tracked continuously during their approach, and intercepted by fighters positioned with mathematical precision. The Americans had possessed total awareness, while Japanese pilots had flown blindly into prepared defenses. The psychological impact on Japanese survivors was profound and lasting. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, who had survived the Philippine Sea battle only to be captured months later, wrote in a memoir published in 1953, "We had fought with courage against an enemy we couldn't see, using equipment that couldn't compete. American radar represented not just technological superiority, but industrial capacity we could never match. They built thousands of radar sets while we built hundreds. They trained thousands of radar operators while we trained dozens. They integrated radar into every aspect of naval operations while we treated it as experimental equipment. We lost the war in laboratories and factories long before we lost it in battles." The examination of captured American equipment after surrender revealed the full extent of Japanese technological inferiority. Japanese engineers inspecting radar sets, fire control computers, and radio communications equipment found component quality, manufacturing precision, and design sophistication that exceeded anything Japanese industry had achieved. The gap wasn't incremental, it was generational. Most devastating was the realization that American radar technology had continued advancing throughout the war, while Japanese development had stagnated. The radar sets that had defeated Japanese aviation in 1944 were already obsolete by American standards. Newer systems with improved range, resolution, and reliability were entering service as the war ended. Had the conflict continued, the technological disparity would have widened further. The lessons learned by Japanese naval aviators influenced post-war Japan profoundly. Many survivors became advocates for technological education and industrial modernization. They understood that future conflicts would be determined by electronics, computers, and systems integration, rather than courage or tactical skill alone. Former Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, Japan's highest-scoring surviving ace with 64 confirmed victories, spent decades after the war lecturing about the importance of technological parity. "We were brave," he told audiences repeatedly. "We were skilled. We were determined. None of it mattered, because the Americans possessed radar that made them omniscient while we remained blind. Future generations must understand that technological inferiority cannot be overcome by spirit alone." The radar revolution that defeated Japanese aviation became foundational to post-war military technology worldwide. The principles established during World War II integrated detection systems, centralized information processing, computer-assisted fire control, and electromagnetic warfare evolved into the sophisticated command and control systems that define modern warfare. Japanese self-defense forces, rebuilt with American assistance in the 1950s, incorporated radar technology as fundamental to all operations. Former Japanese naval officers who had experienced defeat through technological inferiority ensured that radar, communications, and electronics received priority funding and development attention. The lessons learned through painful defeat shaped Japan's post-war military philosophy completely. The industrial transformation proved equally significant. Japanese companies that survived the war focused intensely on electronics, precision manufacturing, and quality control areas where American superiority had been most pronounced during the conflict. Sony, founded in 1946, explicitly aimed to compete with American electronics firms using lessons learned from examining captured radar equipment. Toyota and other manufacturers adopted American production techniques and quality control methods, understanding that technological competition required not just good ideas, but flawless execution at scale. The electromagnetic spectrum that American radar had dominated so completely during the war became the frontier where post-war Japan competed successfully. By the 1980s, Japanese electronics firms produced radar systems, semiconductors, and precision components that matched or exceeded American capabilities, a reversal that would have astonished the pilots who had faced American radar superiority 40 years earlier. Commander Genda, who survived the war and became a post-war Air Force general, reflected in a 1978 interview, "American radar taught us that wars are won by nations that master invisible technologies as thoroughly as visible weapons. We lost because we couldn't see what the Americans saw. We rebuilt by ensuring we would never be blind again. The radar sets that defeated us became the foundation for technologies that transformed Japan into an industrial leader. Our defeat was complete, but the lessons we learned from that defeat shaped everything that followed." The story of Japanese pilots intercepting radar signals and realizing Americans detected them 20 miles away represents more than tactical defeat. It demonstrates how technological revolutions transform warfare, how industrial capacity determines outcomes, and how nations that recognize these realities adapt, while those that ignore them fail. The pilots who flew against American radar-directed defenses weren't cowards or incompetents. They were professionals facing technology that made their skills irrelevant. Their courage couldn't overcome the fundamental asymmetry of fighting blind against an enemy who saw perfectly. Their recognition of this reality, painful as it was, contributed to Japan's post-war transformation and influenced global military development for generations. The invisible war fought in the electromagnetic spectrum proved as decisive as any battle fought with bombs and bullets. American radar didn't just detect Japanese aircraft, it detected the future of warfare, where information dominance determines outcomes and technological superiority cannot be overcome by determination alone. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.